I'm happy about it. I made a mistake. I did not turn that thing on until now. You who are here are going to get something that the rest of your classmates won't get. Okay, I'll move on. All right. So when you start hearing, all right, you're leaving that. Okay, I'll leave that. Anyway, I forgot to push the button. I got to think, did I? All right. Okay, now, the Aztec. These were still, people were still powerful when the Europeans came, and the Spanish had the good fortune of landing on the islands first. And when the Spanish landed on the islands, they conquered the islands, and then they heard rumors of a big civilization to the west. Cortez went, found it. Now, like Julius Caesar, who burned his bridges, Cortez burned his ships behind him and said, we're either going to conquer this place or we're going to die. No ifs, ands, buts, or maybes about it. He almost died. Folk, now I've always asked my pupils this question this time. Cortez's men heard a bunch of hideous screams coming from the Aztec temple. There was a woman there who had the gift of learning languages. Some people do. I don't. Some people have a gift of learning languages. In fact, this woman learned Spanish. She was an Indian woman. She learned the Spanish language really fast. She served as an interpreter. So Cortez asked her, what's the meaning of these screams? And the woman, oh, these are people being offered as a sacrifice to the sun god. Cortez turned to Montezuma and said, your gods are not gods, but devils. Well, this created a few tense moments, but peacekeepers came in on both sides and kind of smoothed things over, at least temporarily. My big question for you is, what would you have done if you had been there and heard the hideous screams coming from the temple and realized there were sacrifices, human being offered? I'll tell you what Cortez did in a real brief. He destroyed the Aztecs, killed Montezuma, the Aztec leader. First, he took him off the throne and killed him, and stopped the sacrifices. All of these people here, the Olmec, the Maya, the Aztec, and Inca, all practiced human sacrifice. Now, I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. The Spaniards used this as justification for the treatment they gave the American Indians. They said that the American Indians had some abominable practices that made them deserving of this kind of treatment. Again, the politically correct thing to do today would be just, hey, let them do their own thing. Who's to say that they're right or wrong? Who's to say one side or the other? And one student wrote a paper on it. He said if you actually look at the morality of the Spaniards and the Aztecs, it's difficult to tell which side was more moral than the other. They were both pretty well equally morally bankrupt. All right. The Inca, next. The Inca lived in what is today Peru. Their descendants are still there. They were also conquered by the Spaniards. Now, from the Inca had tons and tons of gold. We don't know where this gold came from, but this gold found its way back into Spain, and it enriched the Spanish for a while, but then inflation set in, and the gold wound up finding way to Europe. But it brought gold back into Europe, where there had been very little gold for hundreds of years, since the gold and silver in Europe had found its way to China and India, and not gotten its back. There are persons now who will say that the Europeans got rich by stealing the wealth from other countries. You can make that claim if you want to, folk, that the Europeans would not have had what they had and not stolen. But I still have to ask you, from whom did the Europeans steal the automobile? From whom did they steal the telephone? From whom did Europeans steal the airplane? I mean, they actually created these things. But yes, Europeans took the gold from the Incas, and as justification, they said, well, the Incas were practicing human sacrifice. And I want to say this, I mean, just last fall, one of the girls jumped all over me for say that, I mean, she called me sexist, racist, and a whole bit. You can think so going to folk. I want to tell you, people who practice human sacrifice wind up being conquered by their enemies. Among them, the people of Carthage here, and the Carthage people were white. Then Rome did the same thing. Greece exposed to the unwanted babies, so did Rome. And of course, in the case of the Inca and Maya and Aztec and Olmec, they sacrificed adults. The result was how was Cortez able to conquer Mexico with only 200 men and Pizarro with no more than 200 men? The answer is they got a lot of the Indians on their side. Cortez's army consists of tens of thousands of disgruntled Mexicans, what do we call them? Indians, whom he got on his side. Yes, he had, but of course he was helped out. Without meaning to, he used germ warfare. Without trying to, he sent smallpox and typhus among the Indians. The Indians had no resistance to smallpox. Now, it is now known that people who raise cattle, and that includes Europe and India and Africa and a lot of Asia, people who raise cattle have some resistance to smallpox. The American Indians had no cattle, and when smallpox hit them, it knocked out probably 90% of the population. No immunity, no resistance, whatever. It is known if you get cowpox, you don't get smallpox, and girls who milk cows, cowpox is a very mild disease. Young girls who milk cows never got smallpox. Again, your African people had cattle, so do people in India, China, Japan had cattle. So when smallpox visited these places, it didn't hit them as hard as it did the Indians. Now I'm going to get a little bit bold here, and actually if you think I'm afraid of the topic, I am, but I'm going to say it. I just mentioned how that when you practice human sacrifice, you get conquered by your enemies. In the United States, we also practice human sacrifice, but we don't call it that. We call it something else. We call it abortion. Since 1973, 60 million babies have been aborted, and folk, they could make the difference in a future war whether we win or lose a war. We could wind up being conquered by enemies on account of destroying. Now, something else, you younger people, I'm drawing Social Security. It's not enough for me to live on, but it helps. You younger people will not see Social Security because too many of you have been aborted. One out of 4 to 1 out of 3 babies have been born. I will say this, if you were born after 1973, and that looks like most of you, your mother could have. Now don't just go out and say your mother should have. No, but your mother could have aborted you. My mother, I was born before 1973, but my mother did not believe in abortion. My wife doesn't either. All right. If anyone wants to comment, you're welcome to do so. Again, I had a young man sit right here a few years ago and said the United States can't be conquered. Nobody in the room agreed with it. All right. Montezuma was the leader of the Aztecs, Cortez. I've already mentioned this. Okay, now I'm going to move to North America. Well, first of all, no, still Central America, the Caribbean. When Columbus first came over, the Indians he encountered in here are called the Arawak. The Arawak Indians are extinct. But 60% of your people living here carry Arawak DNA. Now, why would I say that they're extinct? Because there are no Indians that call themselves Arawak anymore. They all died out. And Columbus has been accused of being the biggest mass murderer in all of history. And are saying we should stop celebrating Columbus Day. I want to say this in Columbus's defense. One of his flagship, the Santa Maria, dashed to pieces here in Hispaniola. He went back to Spain, and he had to leave a bunch of his crew behind. When Columbus returned with 17 ships this time, he found all the crew had been massacred. This is documented history, folks. So basically, the Indians threw the Spanish were very, very upset, and they started a program that amounted to mass genocide. The Indians appear to have drawn the first blood. The fighting was to continue for 400 years. It stopped. The fighting stopped, listen to me, when the Indians stopped fighting. As long as they kept on, the fighting went on. But when the Indians stopped, The Europeans stopped. I see at least one person nodding their head. Again, you can blame anyone you want to. You can interpret anyone you want to. But it's like I've read recently where that Rome, it was Rome's fault that they destroyed Carthage. That Rome was guilty of mass genocide. But the Carthage people kept on fighting and kept on fighting and kept on fighting until Rome finally said, all right, we're going to burn your city down and scatter all over your broad as slaves. That stopped the fighting. Yes?
I just would like to add, I've read the manifesto that the Spanish and, Columbus, when he came over, and he was pretty much like, we're going to conquer you in the name of God and give you God, and then he just wiped out people. That's what...
Yeah, well, that's the again.
Yeah.
It's there. It's a fact. It's there. And my brother, who spent some time in Jamaica, would tell how that they sometimes just see an Indian just bash his head in for no reason other than the color of his skin. It's there. And like this student who did a paper, he actually studied the morality of the Spanish Indian. It's difficult to tell which one of them was more moral than the other. They were both sides pretty much equally morally bankrupt. But the human sacrifice at least stopped, for at least for the moment. Instead of converting them, well, again, converting people forcibly is never desirable, and it's difficult at best too. And in fact, when the Scandinavians, because it took 100 years for the church to convert Scandinavia, the first generation made a lip service to Christianity. And the next generation got a little bit more of the superstition. And by the end of the fourth generation, most of the superstitious practices were gone, except among the common folk. Now, about superstition, I can tell you this. Being a Southern Kentuckian by descent, my mother was a Southern Kentucky girl, a lot of superstition was still going on there as recently as when my mother was alive. Some of you might know a little bit about what I'm talking about. And lately you can remove warts by certain processes that we now know are completely unscientific, or you get warts by handling frogs. And you better plant potatoes under the full moon, where they will not grow. This was believed by a lot of folk. And the snake will not quit slithering until the sun goes down. If you kill one, he'll keep wiggling until the sun goes down. Things like that. These things among country people, and there was a lot of palm reading that went on, and among some people, a lot of voodoo and sympathetic magic practices that are still going on right here, right now among us. All right. Okay. The Indians who lived in the eastern part of the United States were the woodland Indians. Now that's a big term. Now among the woodland there were the Creek, the Choctaw, the Mohawk, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, but they're lumped together in one term, woodland. The Indians did make an impact on the environment. The Indians burned away thousands of acres of trees. And I'm not going to fault them for it, because after all, they had no real means of fighting a forest fire. So they just simply burned the trees out to begin with. And then when the trees started coming back, burn them again. Otherwise, they'd have perished in the big flames. And even when fighting fires is making big news in our country right now, fires are out of control to the west of us. And for a while, we were seeing smoke here in Atlanta from fires down the Ocoee Swamp. But it took firemen a long time to put out. So forest fire, but think of what it was like for the Indians. So they would just burn away the forest, and they had a lot of wide open spaces then. Now, the early Indians were mound builders. You notice I said the word early. It was like Egypt. The farther back in time you go, the more advanced they seem and the more people they had. It took a bigger population to build those mounds, folks, than what the Europeans found when we arrived in the 1500s. But the early Indians were mound builders. The mounds were used for burial, and they were made of dirt. Catch that? Made of dirt, used for burial. The people we saw when we first arrived from Europe were what your book calls stateless people. In other words, people who had no government, no central government. They were tribal. maybe 200 or 300 people lived in a tribe. And when a tribe had used up all the resources in that area, they'd pack up and move on to the next area. And they were semi-nomadic, but they might stay in one place for a whole generation, so they did not move with the seasons. But some of them were outright nomadic, particularly these people in the Great Plains who followed the buffalo as the buffalo migrated. In what is today New Mexico, we have the Pueblo Indians. The Pueblo lived in houses, usually carved into a rock. And to get to these houses, you had to climb a ladder. Now, the ladder was made of sticks stuck in the stone. They drill holes in the stone and stick a stick. Here was a catch-22. You had to know where to put your weight on which stick. The enemy would not know that, because if you didn't put your weight on the right stick down, you'd go plummet to your death down below. So then again, this was defensive. So every Pueblo Indian, from the time he was a little boy, a little girl, was taught, now you step on this stick, but don't step on that one. That one will not hold your weight. And so anyway, the Pueblo Indians, though, were eventually forced out of their way of life by a sheer lack of rainfall. And the rains, they kept thinking each year the rains will come back, the rains will come back. After 25 or so years, during that time, they would leave one at a time, until by the time the Europeans arrived, there were not very many Pueblo Indians left. They had all scattered out, again, due to the sheer lack of rainfall, which meant, of course, that the crops could not grow. Now, my own take on the American Indians, what was their problem, and I think it was a problem. The American Indians, particularly ones living in where we live, here in Georgia and the eastern part of the United States, the woodland Indians, their population was declining. How come? Well, maybe. I mean, what we now know is that some European fishermen were crossing the Atlantic on a regular basis. You might say, well, how come we don't hear about this? Because there was no radio, no internet, no TV. But these fishermen would get in their boats or ships, cross the Atlantic Ocean, fish off the shores, and sometimes they set ashore, and they may have given the Indians smallpox, typhus, and other diseases, and wiped out the Indian population. Another thing, though, their burial grounds show that the average American Indian living here only lived 18 years. Hardly any of them lived to be 40. The ones who lived to be 10 generally were dead by the time they were 40, or in their 30s. Now, again, part of that low average is due to the fact they had a high rate of infant mortality. A lot of their babies died as babies. And of course, if you know anything about averages, you put a zero in the average, and that brings the whole average down. They had a lot of zeros to average from. But the infant between, even though taking away infant mortality, very few of them lived old, but yet some of them, one here and one there, would live to be in the 80s and 90s and maybe even 100 years old. Here and there, just occasionally, one of them would live that long. If you take a 100-year-old Indian, by the time he died, he would have outlived his son and possibly his grandson and maybe even a few of his great-grandchildren, and outlived the generation he was born with, and the next generation after that. And finally, the fourth generation or so, they lived to see him die. Now, here was the problem, though, with the American Indians as far as their social structure. I believe, and I'm convinced, that they were what we call communist. What does the word communist mean? The word communist means that they lived in communes. We call them villages. Every one of them, right, well, first of all, they had no money, they had no trade, they had no private own, and this is one of the things that really got the white man and the Indians to fight each other. The Indian did not understand the concept of private property, where the white man come in and set up borders, say, this is my land here, and that's your land on that side of the border. The Indians could go, hey, the land is given by the Great Spirit to everybody. Well, the land is free. No, it wasn't. It's owned and bought and sold, and the price is paid for it. But nevertheless, they had no private property. And you might say, well, what is wrong with this kind of living? it led to the population declining and declining from one. And if the European had not come over, there is a chance they would all become extinct. You might say, are you saying that the Europeans stayed in extinction? Perhaps so. They would be, by now, if the European, they would probably be extinct now because they were fast heading toward extinction. But again, they were common, and also, yeah, something else about them. Everybody in a village got fed. The productive, the hardworking, along with the non-productive and lazy. They all got fed the same, whether they worked or not. That gave them no incentive to better themselves, to get richer, to get ahead. We're going to be protected by our tribe anyway. We're going to be taking care of our tribe anyway, so why work hard? Again, check it out for yourself. All right. Here in Georgia, we have New Echota, which is a big Indian mound here in Georgia. It's just west of Cartersville. By any chance, have any of you been there? Okay, I've been there twice. It is some huge Indian mounds. And I want to say that it's so big that the few hundred Indians who were living there at the time the Europeans came could not have built it. The first mounds appear to have been built around 600 or so CE, and then some more added to it later, but they were built by the ancestors. At one time, we thought, no, the Indians were too primitive. They could not have built anything like this. But now we know they were intelligent. They were. One time, they had a lot more numbers than they did later. I say there was no trade. At one point, way back there was trade that went on between Wisconsin and Florida, and vice versa. They did at one point have trade, but then they lost all that. As time went on, they became, again, stateless people, tribal people, people with no reading, no writing, people we just have to rate as uncivilized. All right. And something else too. Generally among the stateless people and among the Arawak, their women were considered equal to the men. Again, you can decide for yourself whether this was good or bad. Just one reminder, the Arawak are extinct, and these Indians here they wound up having some people come in from Europe and take away everything they had and push them westward. This is what happens to communistic people eventually. And again, they didn't know any better. If they could have seen what communism would do for them, maybe they would not have adopted it, but somewhere along the way, they ceased to be a people who had states and adopted communism. All right. Oh yeah, one other thing now I want to say, the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines are found here in South America. Folks, from the ground, if you're on the ground, you can barely see them. I mean, you know, it's just like the stones, the dirt is this color over here, and then over here it's a little bit of this color, but you can't really hardly, you have to be looking for them to see them. You go up in an airplane and look down, and they're pretty plain to see because they're so big and because of this large area. A lot of them are straight lines, and I want to remind you, folk, you cannot make a straight line without some highly sophisticated equipment. The human body is known when you walk along, unless you mark your trail with a compass or with some trees. I mean, they taught us in the Army, line yourself up with a tree, because if you don't, you're going to eventually walk around in a circle and wind up back where you started from and be lost as an Easter egg and worn out after making a long, big circle. But these lines are straight. Some of them, though, are in the shape of animals. The owl was a common animal, and the serpent, other types of animals, and even your authors of your book now will say, one time and one time only, that a lot of persons believe that the Nazca lines were directed by radio contact with people who were in orbit above the Earth looking down and directing them. We don't have another explanation, folks. With lasers, you can make a straight line that goes for miles on end. Again, with our laser beams, laser technology. But Well, did they have laser technology? I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't. We do know this, these people did have balloons. However, we don't know if any living person ever rode a balloon. And what they would do with the balloons, they'd fill the balloons with smoke and put a dead body in the balloon, and the dead body would float out in the ocean somewhere, lose its smoke and drop in the ocean. That was the way they disposed of their dead. You might say, well, didn't they realize that flying, they didn't realize anything of the sort. It just, the balloons were used to transport the dead in the ocean. And of course, in this part of the world, it seemed like the winds blew to the west. And a lot of ancient peoples believe that the west was the home of the dead. A setting sun. The sun goes down in the west. And, all right, anyway, the Nazca lines, animals, which we, oh yeah, in the city of Cuzco, which will not be on the test, but in the city, I believe in Ecuador, they have, all right, you start, the water is here, the ocean, and then the cliff rises straight up 13,000 feet. And in the top of the 13,000 feet cliff is the city of Cuzco. The city of Cuzco was built with rocks that are found at sea level. How did they get the rocks? Now, you can't go from sea level to 13,000 feet all at once. You have to slowly adapt your body to that, to acclimate your body to the thinner air. How did they get the rocks from sea level up a straight cliff? And then interlock the rocks to where no two rocks are alike, and yet every one of them fits together like the piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And the rocks weigh tons, like the pyramid. How do they do it? I'll leave each of you to decide yourself. Nobody really knows. The evidence folk is there. Some of these people were more advanced, and along the way they lost their advancement, they lost their ability. Could that happen to us? Very easily. All it would take would be one little click of a nuclear button, and all of our microchips would go blank, they would be destroyed. When that happens, folk, life, civilizations, we know it would come to an end. And it could be the sun that would do it. The sun sometimes shoots out material that if it strikes the earth the wrong way, it'll knock out every microchip in the world, except for some maybe very deep underground. What can we do with our microprocessors? 50 years ago, we didn't have any. Today, we'd be starting life all over. All right, I better think I'll leave that. All right, anybody have any questions? All right, I'm moving on to the next chapter. I've got to hurry. Islam. It had founder of Islam was Muhammad. He lived in a city in Arabia called Mecca. Throughout much of history, that particularly ancient history, the Arabs would break out of Arabia and spread over the Near East. The last of these migrations was Islam that occurred in the 600s or so. Muhammad believed that he had received a message from the Archangel Gabriel, and the Archangel Gabriel told him what to do. He tried to convince the people of Mecca, and the people of Mecca laughed at him and drove him out of town. He fled from Mecca to Medina. This flight is called the Hijra. Hijra, whatever. Anyway, he made a trip out from Mecca to Medina. And this flight occurred in 622 BC. I'm not going to write the date down, but it is important because this is where the Arabs today, the Islamic, date their calendar. Like Christians date their calendar from the time of the birth of Jesus, even though the man who calculated was off. But Arabs start their calendar with 622 CE, 622, with the flight of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. The people of Medina were converted quickly. Then Muhammad went back to Mecca and converted the Meccan people at sword point. fire and sword, and this was the start of fire and sword religion that the Arabs have, that the Muslims have practiced since. Now, Muhammad went on to then start to conquer all of Arabia. And keep in mind, in Arabia, there are no real heavy, no really steep mountains. It's all desert.